So McDonnell F2H Banshee Company designation McDonnell Model 24 is a single-seat carrier-based jet fighter aircraft designed and produced by the American aircraft manufacturer McDonnell Aircraft. It was an early jet fighter operated by United States Navy and United States Marine Corps, as well as being the only jet-powered fighter to ever be deployed by the Royal Canadian Navy. 1. The aircraft's name is derived from the Banshee of Irish mythology. The Banshee was developed during the mid to late 1940s. It was a derivative of the earlier FH Phantom, although the resulting aircraft would be considerably larger, more heavily armed, and furnished with far more powerful engines in the form of a pair of Westinghouse J-34 turbojets. The Banshee incorporated several recent innovations, including a pressurized cockpit, kneeling nose landing gear and an ejection seat, which the Phantom lacked, as well as a large number of improvements to other aircraft systems. On the 11th of January 1947, the first prototype performed its maiden flight. During August 1948, the first F2H-1, the initial production model, was completed. The F2H-2 was the basis for three subvariants: the nuclear-armed F2H-2B, the F2H-2 knife fighter, and the F2H-2P photo reconnaissance aircraft. Upon its introduction in late 1948, the Banshee proved to be almost 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour slower than the latest land-based fighters, which has been largely attributed to its use of a straight wing rather than a swept wing configuration. Nevertheless, several variants were procured. The F2H-2 was the first carrier-based jet-powered night fighter flown by the U.S. Navy, albeit only in limited numbers, while the F2H-2P was also the service's first jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft. U.S. Navy and Marine pilots often referred to the F2H as the Banjo. 2. It was one of the primary American fighters used during the Korean War, typically being flown as an escort fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. Radar-equipped Banshees were also used for all-weather fleet defense. Furthermore, during 1955, 27 overflights of potential Chinese staging areas were conducted by U.S. MC Banshees in response to a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. During the mid-1950s, the U.S. Navy and USMC began retiring their Banshees in favor of newer and more capable jet aircraft, such as the swept-wing Grumman F-9 Cougar and McDonnell F-3H Demon, and the delta-wing Douglas F-4D Skyray. Several of these aircraft would be acquired by Canada for the Royal Canadian Navy as production of the Banshee was terminated in 1953. Introduced to Canadian service in 1955, the type became the sole fighter operated following the retirement of the piston-engine Hawker Sea Fury. It operated at sea from HMCS Bonaventure or from shore bases as an ORAD interceptor aircraft. Amid a reorientation towards anti-submarine warfare (SW) and reduced value being placed on fighter operations, as well as decreasing reliability, Canada opted to withdraw its last Banshees without any direct replacement in September 1962. The origins of the Banshee can be traced back to the FH Phantom, the United States Navy's first carrier-based jet fighter. 3. This predecessor had been first proposed by McDonnell in January 1943, made its first flight on the 2nd of January 1945. Even prior to production standard Phantoms commencing delivery in January 1947, the company had already progressed with development of a successor. 4. On the 2nd of March 1945, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics instructed McDonnell to produce 3 prototypes of the improved derivative they had envisioned, designated XF-D1. The company's design team had originally intended for this aircraft to be a straightforward modification of the Phantom and thus to share many components between the two aircraft. But it promptly became clear that the new aircraft ought to possess heavier armament, greater internal fuel capacity, and several other improvements that made the original concept infeasible. 5-6. The resulting aircraft required the use of much larger and more powerful engines. The power plant selected was a pair of newly developed Westinghouse J-34 turbojets, which provided nearly double the total thrust from 3,200 to 6,000 lbf, 14,000 to 27,000 and compared to the Phantom, but since the larger engines still had to fit within the wing roots, this required a larger and thicker wing. 6. The more powerful engines were more fuel-hungry, thus the fuselage was enlarged and strengthened to facilitate an increase in fuel capacity, which permitted a mission radius of up to 600 miles to be flown. No provisions for external stores were present on early production aircraft. 6. Armament comprised for 20mm 0.79 in cannon. The U.S. Navy's successor to the obsolete World War II era .50 in 12.7mm machine guns. These were mounted underneath the redesigned nose, as this positioning meant that pilots would not be blinded by muzzle flash when firing at night, which had been a problem with the Phantom 6 from the 10th production aircraft onwards. The Banshee incorporated an ejection seat, another feature that had been absent on the Phantom 6. The aircraft also incorporated a large number of improvements to various onboard systems. The cockpit was pressurized and air-conditioned, while the flaps, landing gear, folding wings, canopy, and air brakes were electrically rather than pneumatically operated. The front of the windscreen was bulletproof glass that was electrically heated to prevent frost. 7. The Banshee was provisioned with a kneeling nose landing gear that had a pair of small wheels forward of the regular nose wheel. The regular nose wheel could be retracted so that the aircraft would rest on the smaller wheels. It could taxi with its nose down, redirecting a hot jet blast upwards to pose less risk to ground crews, and to allow parked aircraft to be tucked under each other to save space. This function was usually removed from later variants, as it was found to be of little practical use and caused deck handling problems. 8. During April 1945, a mock-up was completed. The project survived the numerous cancellations that came around the end of the conflict. However, the pace of development was slowed considerably, leading to the first of 3 prototypes not being completed until late 1946. 9. Into flight. On the 11th of January 1947, the first prototype performed its maiden flight from Lambert Field, St. Louis, Missouri, piloted by McDonnell test pilot Robert M. Eldholm. 6. During this first test flight, the aircraft demonstrated a climb rate of 9,000 feet per minute, 2,700 meters per minute, twice that of the F Bearcat, the Navy's primary fleet defense interceptor. 7. The flight test program, which included carrier trials, was considered to be a success. However, various improvements and refinements to the aircraft were suggested. The U.S. Navy also permitted McDonnell to borrow one of the prototypes to assist in the development of afterburners and to test fly a modified wing design with an extended trailing edge. 6. During 1947, the prototype was redesignated F2H after the Navy placed an order for an unrelated jet fighter from the Douglas Aircraft Company, which had previously been assigned the manufacturer's Letter D. An initial order for 56 aircraft was issued by the U.S. Navy on the 29th of May 1947. 10-6. During August 1949, an F2H set a U.S. Navy jet fighter altitude record of 52,000 feet 16,000 meters. But it wasn't enough to beat the 59,430 feet, 18,110 meters reached by de Havilland Vampire on the 23rd of March 1948. 11. This altitude record was motivated, at least partially, by inter-service rivalries, as the feat proved that the Convair B-36 Peacemaker strategic bombers of the United States Air Force, the existence of which had been a factor in the cancellation of the USS United States, which would have been the U.S. Navy's first supercarrier, was vulnerable to interceptor aircraft even at its maximum altitude. 12, 13, 14. F2H early in its career while still undergoing testing. During August 1948, similarities to the FH-1 meant that McDonnell was able to complete the first F2H, a mere 3 months after the last FH-1 was built. Service evaluations commenced that same month, 15-6. Compared to the XF-D1, the F2H was a larger aircraft in practically all aspects, 16, while the fuel capacity was increased to 877 US gal 3,320 L, 730 MCal. The empennage was a new design, the dorsal fin was reduced, and the dihedral was eliminated from the horizontal stabilizers. The wing and tail were reduced in thickness to increase the critical Mach number, and different airfoil sections were used. The F2H was retrofitted with 3,150 lb F-14,000 and engines as they became available. F2H should be with extra pylon near intake for carrying a nuclear bomb. F2H-P with extended camera nose, post-1955. Although the Navy was satisfied with the F2H, it was the more capable F2H that was most widely used, 17 powered by Westinghouse J3 for EE, E3 for engines. Capable of producing 3,250 lb F-14,500 and of thrust, it proved to be capable of significantly improved performance. The wings were strengthened to add provision for 200 US gal 760L, 170 MPa gal wingtip fuel tanks, but, unlike those of the contemporary Grumman F9F Panther, the Banshee's wingtip tanks were detachable. A pair of armament pylons were added under each inboard and outboard wing, for a total of 8, allowing the aircraft to carry 1,580 pounds 720 kilograms of stores, consisting of up to 250 pounds 110 kilograms bombs and for 5 in 130 millimeters unguided rockets, 1617. The kneeling nose gear was omitted from the F2H2 and most subsequent Banshee variants. 8. Further development. The F2H2 was the basis for 3 sub-variants. The F2H2B had strengthened wings and an additional pylon adjacent to the intake on the port side to allow it to carry a 1,650 pounds 750 kilograms Mark 7 nuclear bomb, or a 3,230 pounds 1,470 kilograms Mark 8 nuclear bomb. 1819. To compensate for the increased load, the F2H2B was fitted with stiffer landing gear struts and a pilot-switchable aileron power boost. 20. The latter was necessary to control the roll to the left when a heavy nuclear bomb was carried. One cannon was removed to provide room for the electronics needed to arm the weapon. 21-25 F2H2Bs were built. 11. The F2H2M was the U.S. Navy's first carrier-based jet night fighter, making its first flight on the 3rd of February 1950. Although only 14 would be built. 11-19. It had a 2 feet 10 in 0.86 meters longer nose that housed a Sperry Corporation and a PS-19 radar, which required that the cannons be moved back to make room. An F2H2 was returned to McDonnell to serve as the prototype for the enlarged F2H3. 18. Some F2H2NS retain the kneeling nose feature of the earlier F2H1. 22. The F2H2P photo reconnaissance version had 6 cameras, a 2 feet 5 in 0.7 meters longer nose and was the U.S. Navy's first jet-powered carrier-based reconnaissance aircraft. First flight was on the 12th of October 1950, and 90 were built. 23. The pilot could rotate the cameras in both vertical and horizontal planes, and the aircraft could carry a pair of underwing pods that each contained 20 flash cartridges for night photography. The camera bay was electrically heated. 24. The F2H2P was a valuable photo reconnaissance asset due to its long range for a jet aircraft, high ceiling of 48,500 feet 14,800 meters, and speed that made it difficult to intercept even by other jet aircraft. 25. As a result, the F2H2P was responsible for supplying roughly 40% of the United States Air Force USA F-5th Air Force's daytime reconnaissance needs. 26. F2H3 with larger radar and reposition guns and tailplane. The F2H3 was an all-weather fighter, with a larger diameter Westinghouse and a PQ-41 radar fitted in an 8 feet 0 in 2.44 meters longer fuselage, which also increased its internal fuel load by over 50%. 23 to 1,100 to US gal for 1,170 L, 918 MPa. This allowed the detachable wingtip fuel tanks to be reduced to 170 US gal 640 L, 140 MPa each, and due to the increased internal capacity, these were now seldom needed. The cannons were moved back, away from the nose to accommodate the larger diameter radar while allowing for an increased ammunition capacity. The horizontal stabilizers were lowered from the fin to the fuselage and were given dihedral, and on all but the first aircraft, large triangular fillets were added to the leading edges. 23. The weapons load was increased to 3,000 pounds 1,400 kilograms and AM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles would be cleared for use. 23-27. The F2H3 also added provisions for aerial refueling consisting of as-needed bolt-on, in-flight refueling probe that replaced the upper port cannon. 250 were built, with the first flight being made on March 29, 1952. 23. The final variant to be produced was the F2H4. It had a Hughes N, a PG-37 radar and slightly more powerful Westinghouse J3 for E-38 3600 lbf 16,000 and engines that increased the aircraft's service ceiling to 56,000 feet 17,000 meters. 28-23. The F2H4 was externally indistinguishable from the F2H3. McDonnell also created at least 48 proposals, including a long-range escort fighter model to 4H, a 2-seat night fighter Model T4N, a 2-seat trainer Model T4P, a 2-seat interceptor Model T4Q, several single-seat interceptors Models T4R and T4S, multiple variants with lengthened fuselages, alternate wings and tails, swept wings Model T4J, and others, and afterburners Model T4K, T4L and others, and various engine Model T4W, and others, and radar installations Model T4Y, and others, few of which were built. Plans for adding afterburners were cancelled after a test aircraft suffered extensive damage to the wing and tail after the afterburners were lit. 29. An F2H-3P reconnaissance variant was proposed to replace the F2H-2P, but was ultimately not built. 23. On the 24th of September 1953, production of the Banshee was ended following the delivery of 895 aircraft. 9. Under the 1960 Unified Designation System, surviving F2H-3 and F2H-4 were redesignated F2C and F2D respectively. The F2A and F2B designations were never assigned, as the F2H-1 and F2H-2 had already been retired. 30. No Banshee flew under the new designations, as the last examples were already in storage and the new designations came into effect. Operational history: U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Banshees on USS Coral Sea in 1955, F2H making a bombing run over Korea. The F2H served during the Korean War with the U.S. Navy's Task Force 77 and the Marine Corps. On the 23rd of August 1951, a Banshee flew the type's first combat mission in the Korean theater from USS Essex. 31. The F2H-2 initially proved its worth as an escort fighter for the U.S. F-bomber supporting United Nations Command UNC ground forces, largely due to its favorable performance when flown at high altitude. Citation needed. The Banshee was able to demonstrate clear performance advantages over the Grumman F-9F Panther. 19. From mid-1950, the F2H had negligible exposure to hostile aircraft over Korea, due to several factors. During the opening weeks of the war, the North Korean Air Force had been almost completely annihilated by UNC fighter units. Later, North Korea and its allies were unable to operate from airfields near combat zones in South Korea, forcing them to operate out of air bases in China. As a result of their air superiority throughout most of 1950, UNC squadrons were able to carry out ground attack missions instead, especially close air support and interdiction of North Korean Army supply lines. 32. The Banshee, like most naval jets of its generation, had a serious handicap. Naval Air Services, including the USN, had resisted faster, swept-wing designs from fears that poor low-speed flight characteristics made them unsafe to operate from aircraft carriers. Consequently, the Banshee was almost 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour slower than the latest land-based fighters. Their obsolescence was reinforced by the introduction of the McCoy-Gurevich MiG-15 in November 1950. Most UNC air combat missions, such as patrols over Megali, were undertaken by North American F-86 Sabres of the U.S. Far East Air Forces. 32. Consequently, F-2H fighters operated most of the war beyond the range of enemy fighters. 32. Banshee pilots scored no victories, while 3 F-2H-2S were lost to anti-aircraft gunfire. Citation needed. The F-2H-2P flew reconnaissance missions during the Korean War, primarily with the USAMC. At that time of the war, surface-to-air missiles had not yet been deployed and few enemy aircraft had radar, while AA guns were ineffective against fast, high-altitude targets. Air defense was still largely visual, and so lone high-flying F-2H-2P was almost impossible for ground forces to shoot down. The aircraft was in demand for its invaluable battlefield photography. F-2H-2PS had US F-fighter escorts when in areas frequented by enemy fighters. Despite being deployed constantly throughout the war, only 2 F-2H-2PS were lost to radar-directed AA gunfire, and suffered no air-to-air losses. The USN deployed the radar-equipped F-2H-3 and F-2H-4 for all-weather fleet defense after the Korean War as a stopgap measure until the swept-wing Grumman F-9 Cougar and McDonnell F-3H Demon and Delta-wing Douglas F-4D Skyray could be deployed. Later Banshee variants were only briefly on the front lines and saw no action. Similarly, The F2H was superseded by the F9 F8P later RF9J variant of the F9F Cougar and the F8U1P later RF8A variant of the Vought F8U Crusader as these aircraft became available. During 1954, a Banshee flew coast to coast, non-stop without refueling, approximately 1,900 miles 3,100 kilometers from NAS Los Alamitos, California to NAS Cecil Field, Florida, in approximately 4 hours, 25. During the Korean War, the US was concerned about the lack of intelligence available should there be a war in Europe involving the Soviet Union, in particular on the location of airfields. The US Navy's Operation Steve Brody, with for F2H photo reconnaissance Banshees or to fly from a carrier on routine maneuvers off Greece and fly north, photographing Russian territory bordering the Black Sea. In May 1952, this was presented to Secretary of Defense Robert A. Lovett, but Lovett cancelled it. 25. Later, during 1955, fears of a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan led to Marine F2H performing 27 overflights of possible Chinese staging areas without incident, escorted by Marine fighter Banshees based in South Korea. 25. Royal Canadian Navy. 3 Royal Canadian Navy McDonnell Banshee fighters in flight. RCN Banshees overfly HMCS Bonaventure. During 1951, the Royal Canadian Navy RCN drafted a $40 million deal for 60 new Banshees to replace its obsolete fleet of Hawker Sea Furies 33-34. However, the purchase was not approved by the Parliament of Canada until 1953, by which point production of the Banshee had been terminated. Accordingly, the RCN acquired 39 second-hand U.S. Navy F2H-3s for $25 million, which were delivered between 1955 and 1958. They would be flown from HMCS Bonaventure or as NORAD interceptors from shore bases. In order to improve the Banshee as an interceptor, the RCN equipped their aircraft with AM-9 Sidewinder missiles. During November 1959, the RCN conducted sea trials of the Sidewinder, resulting in the successful downing of several remotely piloted drones. 35. Although initially well-liked by its Canadian pilots for its flying qualities, the Banshee began to suffer from problems. The RCN would eventually lose 12 of its original 39 Banshees to accidents, a loss rate of 30.8%. 35. One Banshee and its pilot were lost after an in-flight failure of the folding wing mechanism, and another Banshee suffered a brake failure and rolled off the carrier's deck into the ocean, drowning its pilot. 36. Banshee utilization fell as the RCN shifted to anti-submarine warfare ASW, which did not anticipate aerial attacks, and so there was little need for the Banshee under this doctrine. Also, due to the carrier's small size, there was no room to accommodate Banshees when Bonaventure was carrying enough Grumman CS-2F trackers to conduct around-the-clock ASW patrols, so it regularly operated without them. 36. The Canadian military was also under pressure to reduce its budget, and the obsolescent Banshees were expensive to maintain as their age, punishing carrier service, and the harsh North Atlantic were taking their toll. Having been the only jet-powered carrier-based fighters deployed by the RCN, the last examples were retired without replacement during September 1962. 37. Banshees were the primary aircraft of the short-lived RCN Grey Ghosts aerobatic team. The team's name was a play on the Banshee name and the RCN color scheme. The RCN was too small to dedicate aircraft for air shows, so the team flew available operational Banshees for each show. Aside from the 3 former RCN Banshees that survive, RCN Banshees are cut up for scrap or burned in firefighting exercises upon their retirement.